Welcome to Post Games, a podcast about how and why we love video games. I am your host, Chris Plant, and I am so happy to have you here today because I, my friends, have a license to podcast. 007 First Light is the first James Bond game since 007 Legends, which released 14 years ago. Before Legends, Bond games arrived with greater frequency than even the famously prolific film series that inspired them. From the first officially licensed game in 1983, the aptly titled James Bond 007, to 007 Legends in 2012, 25 Bond games hit store shelves. 25 is the same number of Bond films released to this date in total. What happened? How did one of the most popular video game spin-offs go on a decade-and-a-half hiatus? The answer, my friends, has less to do with video games than it does with Bond as an IP and its owners. Well, its previous owners. In the 2000s, under the careful oversight of Barbara Broccoli and her half-brother Michael G. Wilson, Bond was slowly and carefully adapted for modern sensibilities. We didn't get as many Bond films, but we got, I would say, better films, more thoughtful films. Films that could allow Bond to continue on deep into the new millennium. But some of the biggest intrigue with James Bond actually happened outside of the films and the games. It happened behind the scenes, where Broccoli and Wilson faced their own sort of billionaire supervillain worthy of the series in the form of Jeff Bezos and Amazon, who seeked to wrest control of the IP from them. In 2025, following the controversial death of the Daniel Craig-era James Bond and years of this behind-the-scenes drama, Amazon MGM acquired full control of the character. Now, 007 First Light, the video game we're talking about today, it began development in one era of Bond, and it is releasing within another. So, before playing the game, I wanted to learn more about these two stories about modern Bond, the evolution of the character and the changing hands of its creative overseers. To get that, I contacted the most beloved James Bond fan on the planet, comedian and podcaster Matt Gourley. And to learn more about 007 First Light's vision for a modern James Bond, I spoke with the game's narrative and cinematic director, Martin Emborg. The result is an episode that's a bit different, not looking purely at games, but the bigger cultural questions and machinations that influenced one big title's creation. So, this week on Post Games, everything you need to know about James Bond. Act 1, who is James Bond? Act 2, why Bond games and movies have become so tough to make. A Patreon bonus, a history of Bond games in 5 titles. And Act 3, replacing News of the Week, basically, 007 First Light's narrative director on modernizing James Bond. Let's get to it. This episode is brought to you in part by Incogni. As a video game journalist who has been doxxed a couple of times, I am constantly preaching the message of personal data hygiene. Every person, not just journalists, should be aware of how much of their personal information, phone numbers, addresses, health information, and more is available on the internet, and that those private details are being sold without your consent by data brokers and can be used for scams, harassment, and other illegal activities. The problem is so big and so widespread that you could lose entire days to finding who has your info, requesting that they remove it, and keeping these bad parties accountable. That is why I, my friends, recommend Incogni. The moment you subscribe and authorize removal, Incogni begins searching data brokers, online directories, people databases, and commercial databases. You get to watch it happen in real time on your dashboard. When I signed up, over 200 removal requests were sent instantly, and within 30 minutes, 60 requests had been completed. I've been using Incogni for months now, and I can see that they are keeping things up to date. They continue to keep me feeling safe, and protected and keeping my info offline, exactly where I want it. After going independent and not being protected by a big publishing company, I began searching for the right data personal removal service. Incogni is exactly what I was looking for and has already brought me tremendous peace of mind. Frankly, time and time again, because I get emails regularly letting me know all the things they're doing to keep me safe. To get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan, go to incogni.com/postgames or click the link in the episode description. That is incogni.com/postgames. Act 1. Who is James Bond? Matt Gourley is a comedian, producer, podcast host, musician, and creative renaissance man. He is perhaps best known for his work on Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, but you may also know his band, Townland, his horror podcast with Gourley Rust, or his sketch comedy show, Super Ego. In 2013, Gourley and comedian Matt Mira premiered James Bonding, a podcast in which every episode dives deep into the different Bond films and tropes. Gourley is known widely as the nicest person in showbiz, which I am happy to report from my time chatting with him seems to be very, very, very true. For the first half of our convo, Gourley provides a concise history of Bond, from the Fleming novels to the abysmal children's cartoon series. For the second part, we dig into the behind-the-scenes story of modern James Bond, along with our guest's personal experience with some truly middling video game adaptations. Conan O'Brien has called James Bond one of your, and I want to get this quote right because he is very careful with words, orgasmic pleasures. How did James Bond become an orgasmic pleasure for you?
Well, those are his words, not mine. And I would say it started probably the same way that most people came to Bond, which is as a kid, I was watching with my dad and we would have these movie nights. You know, my first exposure to them was either on ABC television or by VHS or cable. And then my dad and I saw Octopussy in the theater when it came out. And I was a big fan just with the experience of watching it with my dad and then loving the movies, both the cartoony versions, the more grounded Connery versions, at least the early ones. And then, you know, later on, I kind of got back into it on my own around the time of The Living Daylights when I was in high school. And then again, a third time when I was an adult and I had taken this kind of sabbatical from work to just chill my nerves out at one point and decided I'm going to rewatch all the Bond movies. And at that point, they weren't necessarily that easy to get everywhere, even on DVD. So I went on a little hunt and just took some time and watched them all. And then I read all the Fleming novels for the first time too. And I just am, I call myself a lover, not an expert of James Bond, but I end up knowing a lot of the minutiae and detail along the way, whether I like it or not. And much to my family's chagrin.
When you see Octopussy with your father at a young age, is everybody on the same page of the title with that one?
Yeah, I think so. I think I knew there was something lurid about it, but I didn't know exactly what. I was 10 when that came out. So I knew that I knew adults would snicker and I knew something was up. I wasn't even thinking I was in on it. I just didn't question it that much though. And it was the 80s too. And we had cable television and my parents were not real gatekeepers to movies. So I had watched by this point The Godfather 2, Halloween, a lot of just raunchy teen comedies with nudity and things like that. So Octopussy in many ways was kind of mild compared to the stuff I had already been exposed to.
It was the language that was so bold and innovative.
Yeah, and then that was too oblique for me to even get. I understood more graphic nudity at that time than I did the parlance of the title.
The 80s were wild.
Yeah.
So like you said, Bond begins as a literary character, debuts nearly a decade before the first film, and Fleming is prolific. He publishes a new book every year between 1953 and 1966. How were Fleming's books received before the films? Because I both know they influenced the films and yet know very little about them.
They hit pretty hard and pretty quick. Casino Royale landed with a big splash. And then by the time you get to From Russia with Love, which was the second movie, but not the second novel, they were well known primarily because President Kennedy had said that was his favorite book and it was on his nightstand, I believe. And that really solidified it, at least in America, to this kind of sensation.
I wonder what parts about it you liked.
Yeah, good question. Good question. Probably the illicit love affair parts.
Probably. What is the earliest version of Bond like in the books? I guess a different way of putting this is, how is that version of Bond different than how people probably assume James Bond to be in 2026?
He's a lot closer to what Daniel Craig's presentation of him is, and to a certain extent, Timothy Dalton as well. But he's a real flawed character, and even he himself mentions that he doesn't expect to live long. He enjoys life for that reason. He's not like necessarily a playboy millionaire. He doesn't have a lot of money. He spends his money because he doesn't think he's going to live, and he moves through women because he was so hurt by the betrayal of the character Vesper in Casino Royale, and that sets him up to kind of not want to get close to women, which then makes the character quite a womanizer. But I think a lot of this stuff is a stand-in, not for Fleming's life, but for Fleming's views. So Fleming has some real chauvinistic and bigoted ideas that, if they don't always pop through the character of Bond, they show up in the books through other characters or even through the kind of narration. So that you take there's the bad side of that, there's the good side of that, which is how much Fleming loved to dig into the details of the way far off locales were, the food that he eats, down to like scrambled eggs. He had a recipe for scrambled eggs that made it into the books, and drinks. And it wasn't just martinis. It was a lot of bourbon and a lot of beer and a lot of American, off the shelf beer too. So the movies really distilled things down. The books are a little bit more varied.
How did it become the Connery kind of, not swashbuckling, but it's a different character than what you're describing for the books?
Yeah, it seemed to have happened naturally. It was, I think, a combination of things. So the first film was Dr. No, which was a later book. And it's a very simple book. It's more of almost a detective story. And there's a certain amount of spectacle. But I think when that movie was a hit, they realized what elements of it were really resonating with people. The next one was From Russia with Love in the films. And that one's pretty grounded and regarded as one of the better grounded James Bond films. But by the time you get to Goldfinger, that's when the formula cements, where you have a cartoony villain, a grand plan, a villain's lair, and real production design and spectacle. And by now, the Martini thing, the Bond James Bond, the Aston Martin, this is the debut of the Aston Martin. All of those things get cemented, and kind of that's the formula for quite a while. Roger Moore comes in after Lazenby, and he changes up some things. He doesn't smoke cigarettes, he smokes cigars. He doesn't drink martinis, and so just to differentiate himself, but then they always seem to find their way back to that.
You did an entire episode of James Bonding on Bond James Bond, basically fantasy drafting, the best version of Bond James Bond. What I didn't understand is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that was not a catchphrase from day one.
No, it's in the first movie, and it's the best one because it's not intended to be a catchphrase. He's at a baccarat table, and Sylvia Trench, who ends up being his kind of mistress girlfriend for 2 movies, she's in the second movie as well, says Mr. And then the first time the Bond music kicks in, he lights a cigarette and says Bond, James Bond. And it's probably the coolest moment of cinema, at least for me.
What I hadn't appreciated until I listened to this episode is how, not just like how the line is difficult to deliver because of the stakes, but the actual line itself is difficult to deliver or justify. Can you kind of explain why that is?
Specifically, if you're doing it now, you've got to be aware of the history and the way that your version of Bond has to both honor and separate itself from that. I can't imagine having to do it now. There's some interview where Brosnan was talking about it and how much it weighed on him to deliver that line. And finally, he just had to just do it. And now they're finding, like in the last Bond movie, No Time to Die, they actually did something different with it. instead of him proclaiming it, he's going back to MI6 after having been away for a long time. And the person registering him, because he can't get through on his own, he doesn't have the credentials, he just says Bond. And the guy looks up at him like, well, who are you? And then he goes, James Bond. And they made it seem more like he's checking in at a reception desk than proclaiming it.
It feels like that could be the only way to do that line, right?
Yeah, because who would really say their name that way? I would never say, my name's Gourley, Matt Gourley. But, well, I think it came actually out of that first Dr. No, because it's not in the books as far as I remember. He says something like, and what are you going to do, miss? And she says, Trench, Sylvia Trench, something, Mr. And he says, Bond, James Bond. So they're setting each other up, which does happen later in the movies, but not always.
That's a very reasonable way for it to happen. If you ever introduced yourself the other way, people would be like, why did I need to know your last name first? What are we going with here? This doesn't work.
One of the best things I've ever seen was on this subject was there was the Ali G show, and I think there was an Ali G movie that, you know, before Borat or anything like that, and he is as Ali G making a James Bond movie, and he tries to deliver that line, but the way he does it, he goes, my name is James Bond. James Bond.
It's perfect. So you mentioned like the general conventions. Bond is guns, girls, gear, gasoline. I would say the public opinion on guns, cars, technology, and the male gaze have changed since the 1960s. What are some of the ways Bond has had to evolve over the years to align with these cultural norms? And I'm not just saying like, how is he different today? I mean, walk me through 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, because all of those are their own bag of opinions.
Yeah, there's some rough stuff in there. Nothing's as bad as some of the stuff in the books. There's just flat out racism in the books, pure chauvinism, bigotry. Fleming seemed to have a real, to put it mildly, a chip on his shoulder for lesbians in particular. I don't know if he was spurned by a lesbian he liked one time, but there seems to almost be an agenda, and there seems to also be a kind of, if the lesbian isn't a bad character, a villain, they then get turned into a good person simply by the magic of Bond bedding the woman. So it's very problematic. And then that happens in Goldfinger, the movie and the book. So the 60s movies into the 70s, even with Roger Moore, in The Man with the Golden Gun, Roger Moore slaps the character of Andrea, played by Maude Adams, who would later go on to play Octopussy as a different character. And he's spoken about that it just didn't feel right for his version of Bond to do that. And I think they were trying to, for lack of a better term, butch his character up. And they did it one other time when he kills a villain that was already kind of like helpless. And Moore didn't want to do those things, and they were forced on him. And by the time you get to Dalton, that's also when the AIDS crisis is in full effect. So he doesn't bed all but one woman. He doesn't go to bed he only goes to bed with the main Bond girl. And even then, I don't think it's explicit. They really toned it down. Then you get back to Brosnan, and the culture has changed, and he's then dealing with the social dynamics of having a female boss, but also still being James Bond, being a playboy. And you get to Daniel Craig, and it becomes complicated in a good way. I think they handled the complication of this version of Bond by updating him to a modern era, but still keeping a justification for his standoffishness to women, being the Vesper situation. But I wouldn't say he's a woman hater. He's just stunted, and he's not up to the task in many ways. You know, he is physically, but not emotionally.
I think there are a lot of people listening to the show who have not seen a James Bond movie that doesn't star Daniel Craig. Maybe they've seen a GoldenEye or something from the Brosnan era. Where do you recommend that listeners start if they want to get a sense of the character before playing the game? And if you need to give like 2 or 3, because it's hard to just say one Bond film because they represent different things, but it's up to you.
I think, maybe I could say one from each actor, and I would say probably From Russia with Love for Connery, because you get one of the most grounded early versions of Bond just on a mission. For Roger Moore, this is going to be controversial because a lot of people think Spy Who Loved Me is his best Bond movie. It's grand. It is good. I find it a little bit slow. Because Roger Moore is the more lighthearted, a little bit more silly Bond, I say push it to that extreme and try something like View to Kill or Moonraker and enjoy how ridiculous it is. View to Kill is one of my favorite movies. He's 57 in this movie and it's preposterous, but you've got Grace Jones as a henchman in this. You've got Christopher Walken as the main villain, who's wonderful. I love that movie. I adore it.
Is that the one with all the cocaine?
Or no, that's License to Kill.
License to Kill.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
Dalton. And Living Daylights is Dalton's first of 2 movies, and it's a pretty solid, straightforward Bond movie. GoldenEye, as you mentioned, definitely of the Brosnans. And then Lazenby's one shot at Bond on Her Majesty's Secret Service. There's a mixed review on Lazenby himself, but the movie is really good, and it's one of the better books, too, because it's the one where Bond gets married. He decides to fall in love again, and of course doesn't go the way he'd hope.
I noticed that you didn't talk about your favorite Bond movie, so I just wanted to give you some time.
Oh, I thought you
with
said
that
besides the Craig.
Oh, well, Tomorrow Never Dies. I just wanted, I figured you would want to be able to talk about it a little bit.
Some people love that movie. It's maybe my least favorite, not because it's a bad movie, but for me.
It's a bad movie.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris.
You're allowed to say the truth.
The biggest sin a Bond movie can commit is being middle of the road and boring. 100%. And that one is a retread of a retread of a retread. It's a very similar story to some that have already come up. I just don't find it that watchable. So if it goes crazy like Diamonds Are Forever or View to a Kill or Moonraker, I love it. If it's super good, Casino Royale or From Russia with Love, I love it. But the closer the Bond movies get to the middle, like Tomorrow Never Dies, The Man with the Golden Gun, that's when they kind of lose me a little bit. I even find Spy Who Loved Me a little bit that way, although it has some amazing moments.
And The Spy Who Shagged Me, that's a film. Let's take a quick break. We're going to come back, and we will also talk about The Man with the Golden Gun one more time before the end of the show. A little tease for everybody. Act 2, Why Bond Games and Movies Have Become So Tough to Make. We are talking now about this road to modern Bond. And I guess what we need to know first is what should the traits of a good James Bond be in 2026?
I think if you talk to anybody, they would all have different opinions on this. A lot of things would have crossover, but there's elements that people love and elements that people hate. I love what Daniel Craig did. I understand that the next iteration of Bond might not be best served by that because it's got to fit the time. But the thing I loved about Daniel Craig is I really believed he could beat people in these fights. And you believed it with Connery, a little bit with Lazenby. But there was something so brute force about Craig's Bond that I want in a James Bond because I don't want a superhero. I don't want a kind of, for lack of a better term, a pretty boy superhero that just glides through things like a Marvel movie. I want to feel the impact of the hits on the Bond and see that there are not only physical wounds, but psychological wounds. I liked that complexity to Bond that they brought. And I think for me, it's hard to go back to the kind of just, I don't know, the Connery Bond and Roger Moore, they all became kind of just Teflon. And that becomes boring because you never worry about them as a character. And I don't think when I saw No Time to Die that I knew Bond was going to die, but I suspected it. And so say what you will about that movie. When I was watching it the first time, I had a feeling of a little bit of dread for the first time. I thought, this guy might not make it. And that to me was exciting.
There are now more Bond video games than official Bond movies. I don't know how you feel about that. Yeah.
That's crazy.
So here's where we talk about them. Well, let's be optimistic before we get into it. Imagine the best case scenario. What is the appeal of playing as James Bond?
Oh, it's got to just be that role playing of that famous line that I think might have come about because of James Bond of women want him and men want to be him. You know, you get to walk in the shoes of the man that every woman wants and that every man wants to be. And in a sense, especially with the video games, you are that kind of Teflon thing, and you get to go up against the colorful characters and just it's pure escapism, I would imagine. The other thing that's great about it, I mean, when you play now these versions of kind of first-person shooters, Call of Duty, or even something like Uncharted, you have to learn the characters, which is a bonus in its own right. But when you go into a Bond game, you come with the understanding of Bond prepackaged, and you can just jump right in. It'll be different for First Light because it's the origin of him. But for the most part, you're just playing as the character you've known and loved for decades.
Yeah. What's weird is I say there are more Bond games than Bond movies. There has not been a major Bond game since 2012. So all of those games largely came in a very, very tight window. It's been 5 years also since the last Bond movie, and probably will be another year or two at the soonest that we'll get one, which is a very long gap. The series traditionally is 2 to 3 years between films, dating back to the very beginning. Just an incredible cadence. What has been happening behind the scenes that has led to this kind of chaos?
Well, first, they finished No Time to Die, which in itself was delayed multiple times because of creative things and then COVID. But then after that, they almost, especially with Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson, take a little bit of a breather, do some theater and things like that. I think when they got back to it, my understanding, or at least my gut, is that they were tired and they were done and they wanted to probably wash their hands of it in some way. And that's when they sold it to Amazon. And you know, that took a while to happen, not just the sale, but I think it probably was happening behind the scenes for a long time before anyone knew about it. And then, so Amazon has to start over completely. I think they made a pretty good choice of going with Denis Villeneuve as the director, but he had to finish up Dune 3. So the screenwriter got to work, and only now, as Dune 3 is in post-production, did they just first announce that the casting is underway, which must mean that they have a pretty solid script to know which direction they're going to go with for the new Bond, because that's almost always how it has happened. They get the script first, they get a director, and then with the director and the producers, they search for the Bond.
And probably means that they have an idea of who the Bond is. By the time you announce casting, it's like,
I wonder.
I would assume.
This time I'm not so sure. They just announced Nina Gold is casting in. She's a tremendous casting director. I think, I really can't think of anyone better. She's put so many people in iconic roles that were unknown, and it gives me a hope that they're going to find a relative unknown for Bond, because there are so many rumors. I haven't seen any that are really substantiated about some names playing the role. And my money would be on unknown before it would be on any of even the frontrunners. I think the frontrunner right now is Callum Turner.
Which seems a little obvious. But then you look back at history and it is a little obvious. Like Daniel Craig played James Bond 2 or 3 times before he played James Bond. Pierce Brosnan played James Bond a few times before he played James Bond.
Yeah, right. It's true.
For further context, can you talk a little bit about the Broccoli estate and why now is a very different time for Bond versus the last 30 years or so?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes necessarily either. I think the world has changed. Star Wars and James Bond are interesting examples of how you cannot satisfy anyone anymore in a monoculture like you used to be able to. When Bond first came out, everybody accepted it, took it, loved it. If it wasn't your thing, nobody heard about it. Now there is so much discourse about it all, and you can't help but notice it and come across it. And I bet if you're the producers, it's a daunting task to feel like, how do you adapt Bond in today's world? I don't know the answer to that. I'm curious what they're going to do. The easy way, I think, would be to do a period version of Bond. I'm interested in that. A lot of people aren't. I think that would be kind of really fun, just also as a diversion. And it doesn't mean you couldn't do a contemporary run. I've been thinking that I would love to see one-offs. First of all, even if you choose an actor that's going to do a run, I hope they're not trying to marvelize and over-arc the story too much, but I just love to see episodic missions. But I would also love to just see different actors do one-offs of Bond in different eras, maybe alongside contemporary Bond, or as part of that mix, one of the films is a contemporary one. But a Michael Fassbender set in the 50s, Idris Elba in the 90s or something. Just different versions of it would be amazing.
How do we get you in front of Amazon? I need this now.
Well, I'm in front of the Amazon website all the time. I blasphemously admit I'm working on that.
It's such a good way, though, to like get what you're talking about, of get the different types of bonds, because you're right. Like, there's a part of me, I love the Roger Moore stuff. I love the silly Bond.
Me too.
I'm ready for silly Bond. And I know if I get silly Bond, then I will immediately be like, well, this is nice, but it's going to be 15 years till I ever get serious Bond.
Yeah.
Or if it goes the other way,
right,
it's kind of a lose-lose, which is a bummer. But then there's also the fear that I have of, well, we're just going to make TV shows.
I know.
We're going to get one Bond, but we're going to get 30 spinoffs of Q and M and everybody else.
And young Bond. Those, I mean, I will go into them with an open mind, but I'm not from the jump interested in those. I'm very curious. Denis Villeneuve is not known for his humor. He's very gritty. And he's great. He's so good at tension and suspense, which is key to Bond that I think a lot of times gets forgotten. And not every director naturally brings to a Bond movie. But I would say actually put that up there as one of the most important things. I'm really buoyed by that. I wonder about the humor. The screenwriter hopefully can bring more to that, and hopefully the actor can too. Because even when the movies are gritty, I like appropriate humor. I thought Daniel Craig's, everybody says he's so gritty and everything, but I think his version of humor in Casino Royale was really good. It fit his Bond. It was pretty much gone from Quantum of Solace and back in a good way in Skyfall. It fell flat in Spectre, and No Time to Die a little bit as well.
I mean, I think the trick is to just bring Duncan Idaho into this series too. Duncan Idaho can travel from Dune to anywhere he wants. We can get zombie Duncan Idaho.
I agree.
It'll be great. And so you bring the joy. You mentioned young Bond earlier. What is the history of young Bond as a character?
My understanding is that the cartoon, the first thing, James Bond Jr., he was James Bond's nephew, I believe. And whether that was a cartoon first or a comic strip, I'm not sure. But it's an infamous Saturday morning type cartoon that has been buried for many years, but I think you can find. And then there are some pretty good novels by Charlie Higson.
I saw the trailer for this game, 007 First Light, and I'm like, okay, it's a Bond who is inexperienced. What is James Bond if he is not confident, has not started drinking to get rid of his sins, and also is maybe a virgin? I don't know, like, what's going on here? Like,
I doubt that at the age they portray him in this game. We saw some of it in the Craig stuff. He was getting his 00 status by doing his first kills. And I thought that was a wonderful interpretation of it. I hope they don't feel the need to go down the origin route again. But yeah, there's stuff in Fleming about his childhood. I believe he went to Eton, and his parents died in a mountain climbing accident, so he was orphaned pretty young. And his mother, I believe, was Swiss, and his father was Scottish. And Fleming incorporated that after Connery played him because he liked Connery's interpretation. Yeah, and I don't think the books ever truly get into his origin becoming a 00. I could be wrong about that, but I don't remember it.
How is the fan base kind of reacting to this? Because, again, people can be very precious about the characters that they love, and especially precious when it's the thing that you love, but now they're cool kids learning how to shoot guns. Are they welcoming this with open arms? Is there a cautious distance?
I don't know. I don't have my finger on the pulse of the Bond fan community, for lack of a better term. I know a fair amount of people within that world, but I kind of have one foot in. I don't go to conventions or dress like Bond or anything like that. I just, like I said, I love the movies, and I love watching them, and I enjoy them. And even if you get a Bond for a while that it doesn't resonate with you, to me, it's gravy. It doesn't take anything away from the old ones. And I'm just assuming that this next Bond, because this will be the first Bond that's younger than me. And it's not necessarily going to be for my generation. And that's the way it should be, because if the franchise wants to go on, it has to adapt, and I will always have these bonds, and I will enjoy the new Bond no matter what. Because if I just get a fix with that music and certain elements of, and it's not just the catchphrases or the Aston Martin, it's more just the look, the tone, and the style. If that's there, I'm going to enjoy it. Because even to me, the worst Bond movie's more fun for me than a lot of the best movies. So I think anybody that feels they're owed a certain type of Bond or a certain type of Bond movie is fooling themselves, and they need to just everybody needs to lighten up and relax. Even when people didn't, I understand people didn't like Bond dying, but this is the 25th film. 1 out of 25, you can't have a little swerve and a zig and a zag. I think that's good because it has to zag to self-correct. The history of the franchise has always been that way. It gets so bloated with You Only Live Twice and Moonraker, and then it self-corrects with On Her Majesty's Secret Service and For Your Eyes Only and Casino Royale, and Die Another Day is an insane movie, and the next one is Casino Royale. So you have to have those missteps to get the good things.
I love that. I want to talk about the games a little bit. I know that you have not played many of the games, which I think is normal. I think I played about 4 of the nearly 30 games, and technically it is my job to play shit.
Well, I'm actually realizing that I've played more than I remember.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What have you played?
Well, before we started recording, you mentioned the Commodore 64, and I had the Spy Who Loved Me James Bond game for Commodore 64. Is that what it is? Am I remembering it correctly?
That's not the text adventure one, is it? That's the one where
it was like a side-scrolling underwater attacking in the Lotus.
Yes, that is correct. It looks like a card that's also a boat, and
yeah,
it's not great. I mean, most of them are not great. What other ones did you play?
So that would have been my first, and then I missed the whole GoldenEye craze. Well, for one thing, and this may seem blasphemous, when the first Nintendo came out, I was a Sega Master System guy, even before Sega Genesis. So, which is so typical to me. I looked at those 2 consoles and went, the Sega system is prettier to look at. How's it going to look at on top of my TV? And I loved the way
This is why I knew I liked you. People who like Sega games over Nintendo, they're just inherently more interesting people.
Oh, really?
It's 100%.
I think at a young age, for some weird reason, I really appreciated aesthetic branding, and all the Sega Master System games came in the same branded look, where Nintendo was just kind of all licensed all over the place, like Atari 2600 became at one point. And I just loved the cohesive universe of Sega. And then there were some games on the Sega Master System that I just truly adored and want to get one again. But then I didn't play the original GoldenEye. I missed that whole craze. And then my next one would have been much later, when Quantum of Solace came out for PlayStation 3. I bought a PlayStation 3 solely to buy the Quantum of Solace, which happened to be a Quantum of Solace Casino Royale kind of full story game. And I played the whole thing. Then I got Bloodstone, which was the next PS3 game, and I played that through. But I'm not huge on first-person shooter games. My attention falls off, and I feel like I should be creating something rather than just staring at the TV the whole time. But when it gets to the little things, like I just got a Game Boy again for the first time, and I didn't even know there was a 007 game for the original Game Boy, and I just bought it. So I just started playing that. And then I think there's one other. What other game am I missing? I know I played one. Oh, I played Legends, and I played GoldenEye later with friends, but after the craze.
Have you started playing the Game Boy game? That seems more your speed. It's a little bit more of a role-playing game.
Yeah, 100%.
You can do some cards. I think at one point you do get a rocket launcher, which kind of changes the dynamic. But
oh, I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it. I'm finding it sometimes a little tedious, but I specifically bought a Game Boy to just kind of unwind and take a game at a time. So at some point I'll dig into the whole thing.
What are you going to do about 007 First Light? Are you going to buy it? Are you going to watch a stream of it? Or are you going to ignore it entirely?
I wouldn't say I'm not going to ignore it on principle, but I just don't think it'll find its way into my life. I don't know. Maybe I watched the Lana Del Rey video song, which was cool. the game looks kind of interesting. It just, those games, for some reason, I wouldn't say it's a fault of mine. They just don't resonate with me. I think I was so steeped in early video games of side-scrolling things that I just like the simplicity of that as opposed to just walking around for hours and hours. I do start to feel like I'm wasting my life, especially I have a young newborn child and a 4.5-year-old daughter. And to me, I'm like, I can't miss out on their life for the space of time it takes to play a game like that.
That is totally understandable. There is one thing that I did want to talk to you about because I promised it earlier and it's just very important to me, which is I was hoping before we could go, you could give me a sort of lyrical interpretation of the theme to The Man with the Golden Gun and what this song is about.
Oh, it's very clearly about assassination and sexual gratification. I mean, it really is just all there on the surface. There's no subtlety. All you have to do is look at the lyrics.
I actually am right now, so I'll read just them to the audience as we take our time out here. He has a powerful weapon. He charges $1 million a shot. An assassin that's second to none. The man with the golden gun. Love is required whenever he's hired. It comes just before the kill.
Yep.
Wow. Incredible. It kind of makes him sound like a sex worker in a strange way.
Well, in some ways he was.
Very, very true. Thank you so much for doing this. This was such a treat for me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Chris. It was great to talk to you about this stuff, and you made me want to dig back into some of these old games, so thank you.
A Patreon bonus, a history of Bond games in 5 titles. Here, my friends, is where we split up. You know how this goes. Patreon subscribers, I am going to give you the history of James Bond video games, not in 25 releases, because that's absurd and most of them are garbage, but in 5 that I think define the different eras of James Bond video games. You will see what I mean. I guess you'll hear what I mean when we get into it. For everybody else, don't worry, I still have a full interview with the narrative and cinematic director of 007 First Light coming up. We're talking about how the hell you make a new young Bond in 2026. You're gonna want to stick around to hear that too. So, let's split. Act 3, 007 First Light's narrative director on modernizing James Bond. Martin Emborg is the narrative and cinematic director on 007 First Light. Emborg previously served as the brand creative director on Hitman, and before that, the art director on the brilliant and absurdly stylish stealth game Echo. I ask Emborg the important questions here, like which James Bond does the game take inspiration from? And, is this young James Bond like a total virgin? I think you're going to enjoy this. I will say up front, there's some slight funkiness with Emborg's mic. I fixed it up to the point that I think it's quite listenable, but I wanted to mention it just because it's a little different than what you're used to hearing on the show. That said, I think you're going to enjoy this one.
To kind of lay a base, if you can, for me. Each era of James Bond, very different. Which Bond does yours have the most in common with?
That goes straight to the core of what it means to create a quote-unquote new Bond. But what we did was we went back and looked at Fleming. That is the DNA. That's where all the Bonds that you've seen outside of the books stem from. You could probably argue that some of the movies over the course of the decades riffed on each other and they became a little campy, if you will. But you don't find that in the books. The books are pretty hardcore, actually. And in that regard, they resemble Connery and Craig the most. I think the simplest answer is Craig is the newest Bond. He's the one that's been in the most contemporary world. But from a character perspective, from the core qualities of the character, we looked to the books.
You've said that you've taken these core qualities and skewed them young. I'm curious what you mean by that. What are the core qualities?
So after looking at and mulling that over a lot and discussing it a lot, we boiled it down to wits, guts, heart, and charm. He's witty, of course, but he's also very smart. He's someone who knows a lot about the world. He's a hungry mind. But we skew that young by it being mostly book knowledge. So when you look at, a more seasoned Bond, he has all this experience, and we stripped that from the character. It is something that actually defines Bond quite a lot. But when you remove all his experience and all his, years in the field, you then kind of whittle him down to the base qualities. Guts, we skew young because he's more reckless. He's reckless in this version. I think Bond is always ready to jump out of an airplane. But as he gets older, it's more, again, it comes down to, he's jumped out of airplanes before. Here it's the first time, and you just gotta go for it. It is the only solution, and he will do that. But there is then this restlessness to him, to this young version. For Hart, I think skewing that young, I think that means that he's probably a little more earnest. I think an older, more seasoned Bond is cold. I think the heart is, I guess, more hidden in a colder, older Bond, where this guy almost wears it on his sleeve. He's not used to all the manipulation and all the deceit and all that stuff that he encounters in this world of espionage.
I pictured something like young Indiana Jones, and I'm curious if there are any other pieces of media that you turn to as a guide when thinking about this, of how do we take a very iconic character and make them young?
Oh, that's actually interesting. We never looked at young Indiana Jones. So how to make, I don't know. I think our version of the character arose also partly from casting. So finding your Bond, I think, has always been, obviously outside of the books, has always been really important because it's that energy that they bring. Each actor brings a unique human energy, and you can't synthesize it. I think the human brain is very, very good at telling people apart, and so I think people get these signature energies. That sounds a little new age, but I think Patrick Gibson, Paddy, he brings something to the role of Bond that only he could bring. And when we found him, we saw many, many actors, wonderful actors for the role, but when we found him, he had this restless energy that we're looking for. He's very funny, and then he has a natural gravitas that he could tap into and actually kind of make it quite heavy, which is amazing to have those two qualities, because he's extremely funny and he has an extreme access to darkness, I think, for whatever reason, and so I think that's what you need for Bond. But that also means that when you're writing the character, you find the voice on the page, and then you also find the voice, in on set. And I think, once we started reading with him, it also informed a little bit what can he make work? What can we get away with? I think before we started recording, I think some of the things we're saying, is that Bondy? Will that work? Is this too much? Is this too little? And then what we found was that a lot of the time he would sell it, and we'd go, that's super cool, or that's super fun, because he'd make it work. And then once in a while, in the booth or on the volume, we'd kind of look at each other and we'd just go, no. Like it would, or sometimes almost be like a physical, no. He would never say that. As with a lot of other things in the Bond universe, it's a lot about tonality. I would almost say that there's no hard and fast rules about what makes something Bondy and what makes something Mission Impossible-y. Because those two on surface level are quite similar, but they're also completely different. And obviously one is American, one is British, but it also has to do with a lot of little details, it is really tonal. There's no other way to say it.
You find out you're getting to adapt Bond. And I imagine the first feeling is, yes, Bond. Who gets this opportunity? And I imagine one of the second, third, or fourth feelings is, the downside or challenge, I guess, of an iconic IP character is they cannot change. They are put in amber a little bit. And I saw, I think it was either you or your writer, Michael Vogt, had talked about, well, Bond can't change so much, but Bond can change things. Bond can change the world around him. I'm curious how you were thinking about that problem when you were telling this story.
Well, I will say, I think Bond is not set in amber for the reason that we know where he's going to end up, right? But we don't know how he got there. I mean, that's probably that's the core of any origin story, of course. But I think in this case, because Bond has been left alone, like it hasn't been stripped mined, and because he's someone who was morphed over the decades, we've seen many different versions of Bond. I think what all the things that we know about Bond as we enter this experience, he doesn't know. And so there's this air of tragedy almost, because he's someone who's hungry for life and he has all this energy and there's a certain innocence to him. And we know that he's going to have to enter all this darkness and all these shadows, and we know that he's going to become cold. But how that happens and what gives rise to those things. We know that he drinks martinis and drives Aston Martins, but why does he do that? How did that end up happening? That's one part of it. And then the other part is we don't know what version of Bond this Bond is going to end up being. We see him journeying towards a destination, but we've seen Bond in many different iterations. And so I think for something like you mentioned Indiana Jones, but he is someone who, you want him to be. He is Harrison Ford, and he takes a punch and gives a punch in a certain way, and you want that's what you want, right? For Bond, I think it's a little more complicated. It's a little less surface area, though. But it totally is, though, because a martini is a martini. Is going to have the martini. It's always going to be a thing. That's very surface level. But those aren't the most interesting things about the character.
That you started with tragic, and that those aren't the most. That like the martini is the most interesting thing about the character is really interesting to me, because origin prequels require a really tricky balance between we want to earnestly set up the character, and we also want to give those familiar touchstones to the audience. And I think the most infamous example of the latter going in the wrong direction is the film Solo, where Han Solo is going through a passport checkpoint and he's like, I'm traveling solo. I'm Han Solo. What familiar characters of Bond are you trying to convey, like the martini, and how do you avoid that sort of almost teeth-rotting cutesiness that can come with the origin prequel?
I think the best answer to that, because that's also a hard answer, and I think Solo definitely had a few toe-curling moments, for sure. I think treating him as a character where you dig into the psychology and, why, his motivations and why is he doing what he's doing, where is he coming from. Treating him as a quote-unquote real character is key. And then a lot of the surface level, as I mentioned before, the martini and whatever. I mean, as I said before, sorry for repeating myself, but those are hallmarks that they don't define who he is because he takes that drink. There's something mythological about this. He's been around for 65 years plus, right? It's a generational thing, and some of these things are almost like Christmas. I might be digging myself into a hole here, but
no, what you mean?
It's almost a tradition that he does that, but that shouldn't keep us from telling a fresh and cool and interesting and surprising, thrilling story.
Yeah. Well, what interests me most about the game, and I have not played through the game, but the way it's been talked about is Bond is almost, maybe explicitly, is vulnerable. Vulnerable in terms of he is not as confident of the best killer in the world, vulnerable and he hasn't learned literally everything. He is not guaranteed the smartest person in the room. Vulnerable in that it's unclear what his relationship is with women, but it seems slightly different than the kind of Sean Connery, Pierce Brosnan type of performance. How do you balance that? You want to afford him this, it sounds like almost more of humanity. He is a bit fresh-faced while still being James Bond. And James Bond is basically always not vulnerable, not those things.
Yeah. I mean, isn't he though? Because I think that's, to your question from earlier, I think what Craig brought to the table more than any of the on-screen Bonds before him was this humanity. There was vulnerability there and brokenness, and he's a very human depiction of the character. And I think Bond should never be, I think Bond should never be Superman. I don't think that's interesting. He doesn't always land on his feet, and that's what makes it interesting, right? He deals with that, and you know, he will save the day for sure, but it's not going to be without cost. I think that's more interesting than someone who's yawning as he's shooting someone, right? So, and I think particularly as we journey alongside this young man whose destination is James Bond. Like, obviously he is James Bond, but his destination is to become 007, the greatest agent in the world. But when we need him, he isn't. And he still has to deal with James Bond 007 level escalating crazy scenarios, but he's just not equipped for that yet. So I guess he'll have to improvise. And there's a great energy there. And he will get there. He will be this seasoned veteran at some point, but not yet. And I think that's what makes it interesting. And don't get me wrong, I love a seasoned James Bond, but this is an interesting angle on the character.
Forgive me in the crassness of this, but this is a James Bond who is largely inexperienced. Is this James Bond a virgin?
No.
Okay.
No. So when the story starts, he's never killed anyone. But I mean, that doesn't mean his body count is 0.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you. That's very clarifying. There have been other media that have tried to fill the young Bond thing. I think the one that definitely comes to mind is the Kingsman series. How is this young Bond different from the many other pieces of fiction that have tried to imagine this space?
Definitely at the beginning when we're looking at, well, what do you do with a young Bond? Like, what's the span that you can go for? Does he start in a hoodie? Like, what kind of dude is he when we meet him? Like, what's the transformation like? And then you do, the answer is then go watch Kingsman. It's a good movie. I enjoy it a lot, but it's riffing off and kind of having fun with the tropes of James Bond, if you will. Working on this has been, and working with a lot of the film talent that's been working on the film, it's been a really interesting education, as I was also alluding to earlier. What are the things that makes a thing Bondy? Like the sound of tree frogs in the night is somehow extremely Bondy. But there's I think for in this universe, it's extremely elevated. There's a luxuriousness to this universe. It's style, it's bedsheets, a high thread count, and I think there's a handmade quality to Bond that I think you don't see a lot of other places. Like it's funny, but it's not at its own expense, if you know what I mean. And I think that there's been the young Bond novels as well that I think Michael T. Wilson actually wrote some of them. There's been an animated show, Young Bond.
Is there one or two things that you found in the Fleming books that surprised you that you didn't expect to be there, having been fans of the movies?
When you look at the films going backwards, they do become campy. And I think what surprised me the most was, for instance, in Moonraker, the book, Bond is very close to an explosion, and in the aftermath of that, he vomits just from the shock wave. And this is because Fleming is someone who knows what that's like. So it's so real. It's really visceral. For something written in the 50s, I think what you can really feel is that at that point in the 50s, World War II wasn't far off. Armed conflict and bombs and explosions and all that stuff was way more real to those people, I think, than to Roger Moore, if you know what I mean. So So I think having like physical reactions like that completely took me off guard, because it was obviously in the books that's in the 50s, and so it just felt more modern.
The idea of Bond having the capacity to react less like a killing machine, a cold operative, and more like human. I think about that in terms of the gameplay. And in the game, you can bluff and charm your way through conversations. But I imagine there's a challenge here, because for me, I'd assume that if I chose incorrectly, then Bond will make a mistake, which then will take away from the role play of being Bond, because I don't see Bond making social mistakes. Do you have to come up with kind of fail-safes so that even if the player chooses the wrong answer, Bond still behaves like Bond?
Yes. And because obviously when you hand the reins to James Bond to the player, they will head off and play it the way that they want to play it. So will they always do the most Bondy thing in any given situation? Probably not. But I do think we can get away with him, failing like a social encounter or whatever, by him being young. And this is also where that's a type of charm as well. Like, he's able to kind of brush that off and say, oh, go onwards and upwards, right? And that's where Moneypenny is a huge component as well, being, his field handler. So she's in his earpiece, right? And they have all these conversations, and we just have, reams of script of fun reactions and comments from both of them. So it stays true to the characters, even though, you fail a thing. Sometimes it's the most fun is failing a thing, right?
As we kind of wind down, you mentioned the Cold War ties to Fleming's work. Bond stories have always been a reflection of current political anxieties. I believe Vogt on your team had said that this story deals with the anxiety around whether technology can do everything for us, or like what value our intuition still has. Was this a story built in some response to artificial intelligence and the anxiety around AI right now?
I think definitely as he gets on M's radar and enters MI6, he meets an MI6 that's very data-driven, where the human component is much less than it used to be. And so there is definitely a theme of where does human agency and human intuition come into play, which I think for a character like Bond is extremely relevant. He is tenacious. He's not going to give up just because the odds are very, very low. I think that's an interesting theme.
Would James Bond ever use AI? Is that a Bondy thing to do?
I think Bond sees, a gun is a hammer, and Aston Martin is something that could take him somewhere fast. He sees these as tools. If he needs to use AI to solve a problem, he will. But I don't think it would necessarily be his first choice.
One last thing for you, which is, what is the best James Bond video game, not your video game, and not named GoldenEye?
I played the License to Kill game on the Commodore 64. I had it on cassette, original, and that wasn't very good. But that's where my journey started.
I would like to say that we did it, that we, like James Bond, saved the world from a billionaire technocrat hell-bent on taking all the joy out of our lives. We didn't quite do that. They seem to still be doing just fine for now. But, tomorrow's another day. In fact, tomorrow's not just another day. Tomorrow's basically the summer. Next week, I hereby declare that it is Persona Summer. With video game hardware more expensive than ever, now, my friends, is the perfect time to work through your backlog. And what better place to start than Persona, perhaps the greatest backlog series of all time? To tell us about why Persona matters for this moment, I am joined by the brilliant writer and designer and pioneer gaming journalist, Lee Alexander. But that is not all. In this double episode, you'll also meet the programmer of Tribeca Film Festival's gaming selection, ahead of the Fest's biggest gaming program to date. Like catching a doubleheader at the stadium on a weekday afternoon, this one's going to be a nice way to relax. Until then, though, a reminder, post-game supporters get the show and the newsletter early on Fridays at 5 p.m. Eastern at the absolute latest, usually way, way, way earlier than that. They get extra acts and bonus materials. This week, Patreon listeners got an entire bonus section in which I guided us through the entire history of James Bond video games in 5 key titles. Plus, each month, subscribers get a bonus episode in my ongoing series, Past Games, in which I share deep dive histories into the gaming anniversaries of 2026. If you're listening to this on the free feed right now, then a new Past Games has just gone live over at the Patreon. It is 40 years of Batman video games with the author of the book on Batman Arkham Asylum. It is a great one. And no ads on anything. Subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/postgames. Subscribe to the newsletter for free at post.games. Post Games logo by James Bareham. Theme by Mark Sparling. And a special thank you to this week's guests, Matt Gourley and Martin Emborg. Like the show? Please consider leaving a review on Apple or Spotify, or share the show with a friend. As for music this week, my friends, I got nothing. I'm not going to publish any James Bond song. I'm not going to risk getting sued or deplatformed. But we'll be right back to having killer game tunes starting next week. I'll see you then.